In this video, I want to talk about retiring off of your investments, in particular, one single stock being Airbnb stock by 2030. I want to take a look at the different perspectives that other investors might have about this company and see which of the outcomes might be most plausible and how many shares you might need of each to actually pull this off. But now let's jump in and actually understand what our goal is of retirement, okay? And first you have to understand what the average annual expenses are for this year. That's about $5,000 a month or around $60,000 a year. Assuming that we, add in around a 3% interest rate, you can see that by 2030, the actual annual expenses would actually be somewhere closer to $78,000 instead of $60,000. But now that we know that, we want to take that and actually see how long is the average annual length of retirement. That's about 18 years long. Let's actually be a little bit more conservative and say 25 years. So whenever we look down here, it says that we need $1.95 million if we're going to be spending that $78,000 per year for 25 years, meaning that we're going to need a starting balance of $900,000 to be able to actually spend that and consistently get that 8% return if we're investing it into something as conservative as the S&P 500. And then even at the end of those 25 years, we should still be left with something along the lines of $150,000 if everything goes as planned and we are able to make that 8% on the S&P 500. But now that we understand the goal, let's actually jump in and look at some of these forecasts for Airbnb. So jumping right in, we have some immediate assumptions. One being that the time of recording, the stock price for Airbnb was around $148, and the market cap, which is all the shares added up all together, which is actually, the valuation of this company, was around $95 billion. So looking at our chart here, what we can see is that this is an assumed 12% compounded annual growth rates all the way to 2030, or a valuation of $260 billion, which actually makes the stock price at $410 a share. This is assuming no change in the actual amount of outstanding shares for this company, though. For this outcome to happen, because it's actually so conservative, not everything has gone completely right for Airbnb in the way that they see it. This includes things like large amounts of competition, fierce competition, that are actually eating away at their market caps and taking away their pricing power. Also baked into this prediction is the idea that vacation rentals as a total addressable market just doesn't grow the way that they see it currently. And you would also see in this prediction a much lower actual multiple whenever it comes to price to earnings ratios or price to sales ratios that also bring the stock down. But whenever we look at the actual amount of shares that we would need to retire off this valuation, it's looking to be closer to around 2,193 shares needed to retire if you're buying them all at the price right now of $148 a share or $324,000. Now, obviously, that's a lot of money up front to actually want to retire on this company by 2030, but this is our most conservative outlook. As we start to get into these higher amounts, the numbers actually start to increase very quickly. As we start to get into more of these optimistic forecasts, what we can see is that the share price starts to increase dramatically, which leads us into our middle point of our forecasts, which is around a 20% compounded annual growth rate or a valuation of around $490 billion. We still have the exact same assumptions that we're starting at $148 and that we're actually not changing the amount of outstanding shares, but the growth in this company really starts to heat up once we start adding in such a higher amount of compounded annual growth rates. This forecast is actually most likely to happen if we only see a slight decrease in the amount of valuation multiples, like their price to earnings or price to sales, only dropping by a little bit, as well as their targets for travel and vacation rentals staying about exactly where they suspected in their outlooks. But how many shares must we need at $763? And that's going to be around 1,179 shares to retire, or a cost of around $174,000 if you buy them all right now at $148 a share. Personally, I think that the midpoint is probably the most likely outcome, but obviously I want to see the more optimistic views and what can actually possibly happen that really gets my excitement up for the stocks. Now, these next two valuations, especially the pure hope category, are by far the most optimistic and just out of our mind extremely high, okay? These are to be only looked at as entertainment and that I would not make significant bets going off of something that is the least likely chance of happening. But jumping right in, you can see that on the high category, we have about a 30% compounded annual growth rate, which leads to a $1 trillion valuation by 2030, or a share price, if you're buying today at $148 and they're not changing the amount of shares outstanding, would be around $1,570 a share. Now, this prediction actually comes from the Motley Fool, for which they actually think that this stock is going to be $1 trillion by 2030. But a large list of demands have to happen for this to actually become the truth. One being the fact that demand for travel and the work from home culture actually increases and doesn't actually do what people expect. People are actually actually hoping that it actually ramps up faster than what the original forecasts are going to be, which that should actually lead to higher, longer stays for Airbnb, where the hosts actually are able to keep tenants in for months at a time, which actually leads to the big money for both the hosts and Airbnb themselves. This forecast would also include the idea that this PE ratio, or price to sales ratio, that we have today would not change at all, and so the valuations would still be very high like they are today, but they are a unicorn of a company, so it could mean continued growth into 2040 and 2050, and so this could actually be an outcome. But jumping into how many shares we would actually need, whenever you look at $1,569 a share, what that actually leads us to only needing 573 shares, or $84,800 if you're buying them at a price of $148 a share. Now, this next category is just for fun and is pure hope. This means everything actually goes above and beyond Airbnb's forecasts, and they truly do dominate the market. With that being said, let's jump right into it and actually look at a pure hope category of a 40% compounded annual growth rates, or a valuation that's just close to $2 trillion. That means that we would have a price target on this stock of $3,057 a share, okay? Which is just mind-blowing today. That's like 20x from where it is today. I mean, obviously there are stocks like Tesla that make that seem very, very plausible, but obviously with Airbnb, we haven't seen a growth in this company of that size, especially at the valuation that they're holding today. To get to this valuation, Airbnb would actually need to join in on a bunch of new businesses as well to increase their total addressable market. That would mean, and quickly, because this is only by 2030, that they would need a full scope of the entire travel and hospitality industry. Competition in this forecast would practically be non-existent, as Airbnb washes over the entire marketplace and actually increasing their market margins because they have full pricing power of the market. Along with those large growth aspirations, what we also see is growth in their valuations as well, making the actual price of Airbnb stock more expensive to buy, as we see price to sales and price to earnings ratios actually increase. With all that on the table, that actually could bring Airbnb stock to this type of price by 2030. But for the moment that you've all been waiting for, how many shares do we actually need for this to actually make sense? Well, whenever you see a target of around $3,057 a share, only 294 shares would do you justice if you held it at $148 a share, or roughly $43,500 if you buy them all today. So that is the full thought experiment of retiring on Airbnb stocks solely by 2030. Obviously, the further we forecast out, the less likely that those things are going to happen. That thin line quickly gets blurred and wider. So things can change very drastically, but it is still fun to think about. But if Airbnb is just not fully doing it for you and you don't want to retire just solely off that one company, maybe you want to check out my 2023 Retire by SoFi stock. But until next time, guys, make sure, if you could, like the video and subscribe down below if you want to see more financial content just like this.